Whakalofalahi atu, taloha ni, kia ora ana tātou, kia ora, talofa. Welcome to this beautiful Fale, and my name is Yvonne Underhill-Sem, and I'm just going to introduce a little bit around some house rules and also just to welcome you again to this beautiful Fale. So I'm going to leave it here and I'm going to hand it over to Sara in her capable hands, and I look forward to having this as a continuing discussion with my colleagues. Sara.
Ma lole soifua, ma maua, ma langi e mama, talofa lava. My name is Sara Vui Talitu, and very warm greetings to you all today, and thank you for joining us for this symposium. I'm moderating this NZIPR session just on this topic of Pacific labour mobility, and it's on the back of something I did for Radio New Zealand. I just finished a documentary around Pacific quotas and just exploring labour mobility in that sense. Is it easy enough for Pacific people to find work before they come here under the quota? And it was part of the documentary, like for me, was very, very insightful in the fact that there are some huge hurdles for Pacific people in terms of finding that job, that permanent job, and being supported in relation to being able to put food on the table, pay bills, and live here in New Zealand. So I interviewed Yvonne as part of that package, and she asked me to moderate this session today, so thank you very much. I'm a senior journalist. I've been reporting on the region for about over a decade. I work for Radio New Zealand Pacific team, formerly RNZI, Radio New Zealand International. We broadcast all over the region, where different stations in the Pacific take our feed every hour, every day, and our programs. Of course, in internet age today, a lot of our stories are able to be accessed online and through the Radio New Zealand website. The thing about storytelling for me is it's powerful in the sense that being able to tell stories, we can see some of the gaps in society, some of the ways that how we can improve life for each other and the communities, and being able to do things better. So my reporting interests do include labour mobility, and I just want to say some of the questions that I have already for the session are about some of the recent developments in the seasonal work schemes, for example. So how can we improve employment opportunities for Pacific people coming here? What are the options for Pacific in terms of work and employment? And are there social impacts on families who come here from the islands? And can we do more? So I will introduce each panellist now, and I'll ask that you identify yourself with a wave. And I also encourage you to tweet as we go through the session. And we've decided our Twitter tag will be hashtag PLM, short for Pacific Labour Mobility, NZ. Okay, so hashtag PLMNZ. So our first panellist today is Associate Professor Ward Friesen. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland School of Environment. He has a long-standing research relationship with Melanesia, and in particular the Solomon Islands. His research centres on sustainable livelihoods, international and internal migration and identities, population change, environmental relationships with development, and community-based tourism. Ward is well known in New Zealand for his research and writing relating to immigration and ethnic change, especially in Auckland, but in other parts of the country as well. Ward is originally from Canada, but he's been a resident of New Zealand since starting a PhD degree. His interest in migration is diverse and covers many aspects of the process and outcomes of migration, including demographic imperatives, sustainable livelihoods, and the creation of ethnoscapes, or distinctive migrant communities in host countries. Our second panellist is Associate Professor Yvonne Underhill-Sem. She's a development studies specialist leading a project on seasonal labour markets for the New Zealand Institute of Pacific Research. She's an associate professor at the University of Auckland, co-chairperson of Oxfam New Zealand, and a major contributor to research on women and development in the Pacific. So a hand for Yvonne. Third on the panel, it will be Richard Bedford. He is a migration specialist. He's carried out research on international migration in Kiribati, linked with resettlement schemes in the 1960s and temporary labour migration to New Zealand in the 1990s, and under the recognised seasonal work scheme since 2007. He's currently President of New Zealand's National Academy, the Royal Society Te Aparangi, and an Emeritus Professor at the University of Waikato, and an advisor to Immigration New Zealand's Pasifika Labour and Skills Team in the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Last but not least is Professor Vijay Naidu. He is a Professor of Development Studies in the School of Government, Development and International Affairs, an Adjunct Professor at VUW, Victoria. Adjunct Professor, Faculty of Health, Arts and Design, Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. He's researched many topics including aid, development policies, urbanisation, informal settlements, the post-colonial state, small island states and globalisation. He's a Fijian citizen with professional links to universities here in New Zealand and in Fiji. He brings with him historical and contemporary knowledge concerning Fijian labour mobility and Fijian economic and demographic structures. Welcome, Vijay. Okay, so I'll just ask the panel to take your seats at the front, if that's okay. Oh, you want to watch the? Oh, okay, all right. So first up, we will have our first speaker, who will be Associate Professor Ward Friesen. Thank you.
Kia ora, Sara, tēnā koutou katoa, tolo falava, and all the other Pacific greetings, which I usually do to my class, but I'm a bit tight on space just now. I've been given a rather big brief here for 10 minutes, which is a brief an overview of demographic and migration trends, and basically what I'm going to do is just talk about, to a few particular slides on demography, population change, and then a small number on migration. I have a lot of slides in this PowerPoint, but I'm not going to be covering them all. I'll keep them as standbys if we need to come back for some kind of information on particular aspects of migration. So in some respects, there might be more questions than answers in some of these talking about some of these slides, because I don't have all of the reasons why we have high fertility here, low fertility there, high migration here, low migration there, in migration, out migration, and so on. So I'm just kind of setting it up for these other experts to give the answers that I'm raising the questions for. And one thing I should say, the slides, some of them are not properly, I've just been putting them together in the last day or so. They're not properly kind of credited, but most of the initial ones, the demographic slides, the 6 or so slides, come from the Secretariat for the South Pacific database, which was updated in 2016 using censuses from various periods. Some of those censuses are more or less 10 years or so out of date. Others are much more recent, but they have attempted to update the rates and so on up to 2016, and that was the basis of some projections that briefly enter in here as well. So those are the first few slides anyways, so they should be credited, SPC, PRISM database. The images are actually my own. I hope you can read the base here, the various countries and territories of the Pacific. And this is basically just showing you the average annual rate of population change. So on the left there, you have negative change. And the axis has fallen off, but we don't need the axis here, because you can see the rate, the annual average rate of population change. So on the left there, we have countries of loss, which are mostly of the smaller nations. It's a little bit hard to generalize, as to why we have this huge range, but basically I would say it's related to the two other factors I'm going to talk about, which is natural increase, especially driven by differences in fertility rates, and net migration rates. I guess if you're trying to generalize about this slide, one thing you could say is that the largest, the fastest growing Pacific nations are in Melanesia. The larger countries of Melanesia, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, and New Caledonia a little bit less, but still relatively high. And then one or two others, Nauru, for example, which is a relatively small population base. So these are percentage growth. So you have to think of the kind of scale as well as the rate of change. So one of the issues then, of course, is in terms of population change is net migration. This one is actual absolute numbers of migrants in recent years, and to some extent these numbers form the basis of the projections that the SPC has been doing, and so it's over recent years. It hasn't got exact, one single year. It's partly based on change between the last two censuses in some of those countries, but also that those assumptions that go into those projections have been modified according to other information besides censuses, which include monitoring of arrivals and departures in some cases from particular countries. So you can see the largest kind of population change, net migration ongoing change is in Fiji in terms of numbers, an average of just over 5,000 a year, and Samoa an average of just over 3,000 a year, and so on, and Tonga 1,900. These are so absolute numbers, but you have to remember these are on very different population bases in terms of the impact of this kind of migration loss. So you can see all nations in the Pacific, with the exception of New Caledonia, and then Papua New Guinea sitting on zero. That's not a missing value, that's actually a zero, a net balance, if you like, in Papua New Guinea. All these other nations are losing population via migration. This just takes that same data and puts it into a rate, so rate per thousand. Up there on the left is New Caledonia, and ranging to the right are so New Caledonia had a population gain, has been having a population gain of about 3.7% over recent years. And down to the right here, Tonga, with the greatest loss on 18.7 per thousand. So that's not percentage, that's per thousand. So that's actually 1.9% per year. A loss closely followed by Marshall Islands and Federated States of Micronesia, and then Samoa. So those four countries with the largest loss, two of them are in Polynesia, countries that have a lot of migration to New Zealand and to other places, in the case of Tonga and Samoa, to Australia to some extent, and to the United States. The Micronesian countries, of course, mostly losing population or population migrating to the United States. So this is more kind of, speaking to the impact that migration might have on those particular nations, because it's a rate of population loss. And then the one other factor that is one other factor that is significant is the fertility rate. So in terms of some of those countries that have high out-migration might also have high fertility, and therefore that compensates, and so the rate of population change is impacted by, is moderated by the fertility rate. In trying to generalize on this, it's pretty difficult to generalize by region or by particular explanation according to why some countries have such high fertility. Samoa, for example, 5.1, a TFR of 5.1 is pretty high. We have countries elsewhere in the world, that in Africa, for example, that might have TFR of 7 or 8, which is really high. But that, by global standards, 5.1 is quite high. And then, of course, the three following that, the three larger countries of Melanesia, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and Solomons have the highest rate. And over recent decades, those countries of Melanesia have tended to be have the highest total fertility rate. I'll let somebody else explain why there's such a high rate in Samoa, but it certainly does kind of offset the impact of net migration loss. Sorry about the quality of these. These I've just kind of clipped out of the digital copy of the SPC projection chart. But it's basically showing you some of the impacts. So I've only put 4 countries up here, relatively different kinds of experiences of 4 different countries. So in the middle, so I have a pointer here, in the middle of each of these is the 2016 population structure, age-sex structure. And so you can see over here, in terms of Fiji, the 2016 structure is actually overlapping the projected structure for 2050. In other words, there's going to actually be decreases. So sorry, and so the second part of it, a little bit hard to see over here. The second part of these graphs is the darker colors. So in this case, Kiribati, substantial increase across all age cohorts. In the case of Fiji and Tonga, actually decreases in the younger cohorts, but increases at older ages, so an aging population, but also very much impacted by that net migration loss we saw before. Whereas in the case of Kiribati and Solomons, very much ongoing kinds of growths in all cohorts. But the ones we're, I guess, especially interested in this session relate to the kind of the youth cohorts. And so you can see that in both of those cases, there's very kind of substantial increases in these ages, 15 through to 35, 40, whatever. I'm not sure what youth are. In Tuvalu, they tell me youth are up to 34 years old. So I guess we could think of, those cohorts as being 15 to 35. And so one of the things I was asked to say something about was the idea of the youth bulge. And I've done a lot of my work in the Solomon Islands, related to the Solomon Islands. So I'm just using this particular example. So one of the things about the youth bulge is that the assumption that fertility rates are going down, which they have been doing in the Solomons. The Solomons did have fertility rates of total fertility rate of about 7. And total fertility rates is kind of a proxy for average family size, I guess. In the 1970s, they had total fertility rates of around about 7, declining quite rapidly after that, down to about 4. So you can see that, so these are from censuses from 1976 and ranging up to those projections from the SPC, that the proportion, these blue bars are the absolute number of people, of youth. So in this case, I've used the category 15 to 24 as being those who are entering the labor force or who need tertiary education, secondary, tertiary, or who are eligible for secondary, tertiary education, or are entering the labor force. And the absolute numbers, as you can see, continually will increase, have increased and will increase. The proportion isn't quite as clear as that. It varies a little bit as the fertility declined in the 1980s and 1990s. The actual proportion of the population that was aged 15 to 24 has increased, and then it's slowed down as kind of that cohort came through, and there's kind of what you might call an echo effect here, and in just now happening, increase in those proportions again. But I guess the issue is with the youth bulge is that as opposed to the idea of aging, that we're aging and therefore the youth population will decrease over time. In these populations with reasonably high fertility in the past, there's this momentum effect causing the youth proportions to remain almost the same, quite high proportions, and rather than declining with the aging population and the declining fertility. So in a sense, we could say in this case, in the Solomons and Vanuatu, and in some of the other countries of Polynesia, some of the countries of Polynesia as well, there's been some problem with enough resources providing secondary and tertiary education. and not enough, at least formal sector jobs, and probably in some cases not enough informal sector jobs. And so there's a problem that the cohort is not declining in size. The demand is ongoing, and yet the demand in the past hasn't been reached for some of those requirements for youth education and employment. And unless something radically changes, there's a problem ongoing into the future. I think I've used my 10 minutes up. So I've got a lot of other slides here, which I won't go through, but are here as references, which we can flash back to at some point. So I wasn't paying attention to your waving at me, but I'll just turn it off here. Turn it off here. Okay. So there's more about some of the migration data if we want to come back to that if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate Professor Ward Friesen. So I was going to have a bit of a question session after each speaker, but it might drag. Do we have a preference in the audience in relation to hearing everyone first and having question time at the end? Or do you want to have questions as we go along? Okay, all right, that sounds good. The next speaker we have, I'd like to introduce Professor Yvonne Te Ruki Orangi Underhill-Sem. She will talk about the systematic literature review around the range of research in the region on this topic.
Kia ora, Sara. One of the, and I thank Ward for laying out, I think, a really useful demographic analysis of what's happening in our populations. And of course, one of the things you mentioned was that there are lots of different implications of that particular demographic structure, and not only the structure, but the dynamics of it, because within that, there are lots of different choices and options that people can make. One of those, of course, is to not be in their country, be in your country, and to move for education, for work. And of course, we can't forget that in this time of climate change, there's also a consideration of people needing to move because they no longer have land to live on. So when NZIPR was set up, one of the very important first projects they were keen on was to understand a little bit more about the labour market in the Pacific, and in particular the place that labour mobility programs and policies can play in trying to deal not just with the immediacy of New Zealand's demand for labour, but also, as Ward pointed out, the fact that in the future there is going to be a continued demand for labour because of what we call the youth bulge, or that demographic shift. And I think I'll be really keen to talk a little bit later about this whole notion of the demographic dividend and what that actually means. But in the course of trying to understand a little bit more about the implications of labour markets and labour mobilities, of course there have been many people who have written about this, three of whom are sitting over there. And I was able to work a research project with a colleague of mine, Evelyn Masters, and we developed a project which first of all started to look at the research that had already been published. This is the result of that piece of work. What we were able to do before we kind of moved into what kind of policy options were available for countries was also to ask what have we learnt already from the research that's out there. Now this compendium, this systematic literature review, there are copies at the back, feel free to take those. And what we effectively did in here was to say there's a lot of research out there, what has it told us? Where are the kind of directions that we need to go with that research? So we're just in the process really of completing this project. We did the systematic literature review with Evelyn and I did. Professor Bedford and myself were able to go to Kiribati and start the process of talking to policymakers there about what they're thinking, where they're going, and Dick will be able to talk a bit more about that. I will be travelling to Fiji with Professor Naidu next week to start the discussions with Fiji in terms of where they are thinking that their discussions might go, their policy discussions might go, and then early next year, because of the election in Tonga in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be talking also to Tonga about where that's going. And what we're trying to do in these discussions is to say, given the research that we were able to bring together in this particular report, there's a lot that we learnt from this. We learnt about a lot of the wins and a lot of the benefits, but we also uncovered some kinds of concerns that were coming up as well. And those concerns were about the social impacts of the kind of mobility that's happening. There were concerns raised about the numbers of people that may or may not go, and not only the numbers of people, but in particular who's travelling. Are they the same people who are travelling to take advantage of labour options in New Zealand and in Australia? So there's a lot more work that we can continue to do now that we've got a better understanding of what we currently know. I think the important part about doing the systematic literature review was that we were able to work with the triple wins framework, which is the kind of the logical explanation that has been handed down around why you would have seasonal labour programs. And the triple wins framework has been around for a very long time, and it makes a very clear and logical case that in order to understand the value of a project like a policy, like a labour mobility project policy, we can look at the wins for the individuals, we can look at the wins for the countries who send those individuals, and we can look at the wins for the countries who receive them. So I think that's quite a useful framework, and it's one that we worked on as we developed the kind of research that we're coming through. But in the course of doing that, of course, it's not all wins. And so it also gives us the opportunity to say what were some of the losses or what were some of the drawbacks of some of these. And what we do know from research, especially in Kiribati, and I'll let Dick talk a little bit more about that, but there have been long-standing seasonal or labour mobility programs in the Pacific before. And there has been some good research that has showed over time that there are longer term impacts on that. And so we need to get a better understanding of what those impacts are in order to mitigate them if we were to increase the number and the nature of seasonal mobility that not only is being sought by employers in New Zealand, but is also being sought by countries. So Pacific countries are very interested in how they deal with these large numbers of young people who are continually coming into the education and their employment, into needing education and employment. I think one of the things that was also really important as we went through this project was the value attributed to the kinds of relationships that all of these seasonal mobility and labour mobility programs develop. And so it's not just a simple matter of capturing people from one village in some remote area and bringing them over to a remote location in central Otago. A lot of consideration by both employers and people who kind of facilitate that movement rests on that notion of relationship building. So I think that was really encouraging, and I think there really was a genuine interest in ensuring for the successful sustainability of these programs that attention is given to the relationships that are built. So that can also work both ways, of course. So you can have a good relationship which can facilitate more mobility. You can get the negotiation going around there where there's kind of respectful relationship between everybody involved. It can also work the other way when relationships are torn or stressed. Work needs to be done in those spaces as well. So I think it's really important to think about both that issue of who wins and who loses, but also how any of these programs work in terms of the relationship building. So the relationships between different countries, of course, is a critical one in the negotiation of PACER Plus. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that, possibly from my colleagues, but it's certainly something that is exercising the mind right now, I think, of MFAT and how it gets into that negotiation. So what we're hoping is that this systematic literature review does give us a better sense of the range of material that's out there, research that's out there, some of the key points that have been learnt from that research, and so that does put us in a better position to develop research projects and processes that are going to work for both everybody involved. And you know, the good thing is that there's a lot more research coming out from that. So I'm happy to leave it here for now, and I want to get into a little bit more discussion. I was just really wanting to introduce the Systematic Literature Review. The project itself that we're working on is not complete. We will have it complete by March of next year, and I'm very excited about the way in which I think we were able with our team to develop relationships with policymakers as well in the Pacific. So Sara, I'll leave it there, and happy to take any smaller comments, but also very happy to come back later on and discuss further. Kia ora.
Any quick comments or at this stage for the two speakers we've had already? I think you all lovely. Okay. Well, moving along, I'd like to just call now Professor Richard Bedford, or Dick, to come and discuss the Kiribati situation. Thank you.
Kia ora ana tātou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and give you perhaps actually some reflections more than new material, because one of the things I've become very conscious of over the last number of years is the very strong link between New Zealand and these atoll territories, the two atoll territories that we're going to focus on in the Pacific and that have been the focus of the work that Yvonne referred to, Kiribati and Tuvalu. I'm into anniversaries because my current role as President of the Royal Society Te Āpārangi happens to coincide with the 150th anniversary of our National Academy. So I've reflected for a minute or two on some significant anniversaries that relate to New Zealand's links with Kiribati and Tuvalu. And if we don't go back right to the beginning, which was formation of the British Phosphate Commission, which was a commission involving New Zealand, Australia and the UK to exploit the phosphates of Naidu and Barnaba, but come to a 70th year, this year, the 70th anniversary of the requirement to relocate the entire population of Barnaba, or Ocean Island, in Fiji, because the British Phosphate Commission required access to the land, the only little bit of land left that they had under their village, to extract the phosphate. So this phosphate was very significant for New Zealand's development, very significant for the development of our dairy industry, our pasture economy. So we have a very close connection with Kiribati through the phosphate industry, and as a very prominent Kiribati academic, Teresia Te Awia, who died not too long ago, pointed out, much of the land of New Zealand today has mixed with it the land of Kiribati, particularly the land of Ocean Island and Nauru, which is not in Kiribati, obviously. And she just posed an interesting question, which I think is really significant in the context of Pacific people and their way they approach land, and also New Zealand's Maori population and the way it approaches land. Land is not separated from people. It is part of people. There is not this Cartesian division between humanity and the natural world. And so for many Pacific people, it's extremely difficult to understand somehow how you can separate yourself from the land that is actually your land. The significance of that hasn't been lost in the debate about climate change, in the context of, well, if our land's mixed with your land, maybe we continue to share land in the longer term. So 70 years ago, New Zealand was part, not the government, but through the British Phosphate Commission, part of a group that saw the first really significant resettlement of people from the country that's now called Kiribati in another part of the Pacific. New Zealand provided the resident commissioners for Kiribati and Tuvalu, when it was the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, through the 50s and 60s, up until the last senior official, who was a governor, who was of Scottish origin, who was appointed in the 1970s to take those two island groups through to independence. The New Zealanders who were involved in the administration as resident commissioners played a significant role in developing opportunities for employment offshore, in particular in the 1960s, with the beginning of the seafarer training program, which has arguably been the most significant development in terms of offshore employment for Kiribati and Tuvaluans since the phosphate mining, which on Nauru and Ocean Island. The Ocean Island mining finished in about 1979, very soon after Kiribati became an independent country, and in Nauru it finished in 1997. So the seafarer training, that was a negotiation between the colonial government and the Hamburg Sud, a major ship company in Germany in the 1960s, saw the launching of what I still regard as one of the best New Zealand aid-supported programs in the region. The Marine Training Centre in Tarawa is an extremely impressive development, and I strongly commend Foreign Affairs, New Zealand Foreign Affairs, in fact, for continuing to be very supportive of that particular initiative. So that was 50 years ago, 1967. 50 years ago actually also happens to be a rather significant anniversary for me, because that's when I completed and handed in here at the University of Auckland a master's thesis on resettlement as a solution to social and economic problems in Kiribati and Tuvalu. What was a bit odd, though, was this was well before the debate about climate change. So there's nothing new about the debate in those island countries around problems associated with what Ward's been referring to, the population growth issues, and linked with those, the problems of urbanisation. And perhaps the most interesting resettlement program that I looked at in that thesis was one that came initiated by a group of Matai on the island of Vaitupu in Tuvalu. They purchased an island in Fiji, and they purchased it in the 1940s with a view, long-term, to having a place where they might be able to have some of their people, not all their people, some of their people live, should their own island become overcrowded. So this is thinking about possible futures years and years and years before the climate change debate finally got underway. We shouldn't lose sight of the debates that took place and the search for alternative places of residence that was occurring in the 1960s, but linked with that, perhaps even more importantly, we must never lose sight of the fact that Pacific people have, in their own traditions, moved around. And Apeli Hauofa, the late Apeli Hauofa, reminded us that the most constraining thing on Pacific mobility was the boundaries drawn by the colonial powers. That has done more to inhibit mobility in the region than anything else, because Pacific people did move, and if they needed to move, they negotiated access to alternative places to live. If we can get back to some of the thinking that underpinned that era before the colonial period in the Pacific, in our own approach to mobility in the region, we might actually be able to do something really constructive in the longer term for futures of Pacific people. A few more anniversaries though. 1977, the leaders of Kiribati and Tuvalu, then still the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, made the decision to separate into two countries. Final decision to do that, and in 1978 Kiribati was formed as an independent state. In 1979, Tuvalu was formed as a separate state. 30 years ago, in 1987, the Immigration Act in New Zealand, the most important immigration act in the 20th century, actually, which implemented or provided the framework for the 1986 Immigration Policy Review, allowed for 2 work programs, one for Kiribati, one for Tuvalu, temporary work programs in New Zealand, and also allowed these 2, and only these 2 Pacific countries, to have visa waiver access for visitors in New Zealand. They had offered that briefly to Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, but they cancelled it within months of offering it. But for Kiribati and Tuvalu, they kept it open. This was really significant in the development of mobility between Kiribati and Tuvalu and New Zealand. In 15 years ago, though, in 2002, New Zealand terminated the work programs for Kiribati and Tuvalu, terminated the visa waiver arrangements, and gave them as a substitute for those 75 places each under the Pacific Access category, which was introduced in 2002. I'm not sure from the point of view of Kiribati and Tuvaluans that the trade-off was a great one. And in fact, Sara's Insight program makes it really clear that one of the real challenges around the PAC program, which was less of a challenge around the temporary work scheme, was actually finding work in New Zealand because of the constraints, the income constraints that are built in increasingly into New Zealand immigration policy. And I do want to put on record that the recent introduction of a firm income threshold in the temporary migration scheme really has to be examined again very, very carefully in terms of whether it will create far more perverse outcomes for the labour that New Zealand is wanting to attract under the temporary schemes than deliver really good returns. These very rigid numerical income-related targets, as Sara's already shown in her work on Pacific Access category, where you have to have a job up to a certain income, create huge problems for migrant labour. And I don't think this is a direction that will be helpful for New Zealand as we move into the long term. And then finally, to finish my anniversaries, 10 years ago, as Yvonne said, was the introduction of the recognised seasonal employer scheme, arguably the world's best, according to the World Bank and according to the ILO, best seasonal migration scheme anywhere. And it's the best seasonal migration scheme because it was conceptualised as a complex system. It wasn't conceptualised simply as New Zealand orchards need labour and Pacific Islanders need jobs. When you look at the framework within which the RSE was conceptualised, it has all the elements that Yvonne referred to. It refers not just to employers and labour, it refers to communities, it refers to families, it refers to regions. Unfortunately, over time, what happens with those complex systems is they become implemented into real migration schemes. They become very much focused around just the employment relationship. And the biggest challenge I believe the RSE faces now, and it's acknowledged by the people who run the RSE and certainly also in MFAT, and it's driving some new thinking in the RSE scheme, is around its impacts back in island communities, but also its impacts in New Zealand communities. Because when you bring very significant numbers of temporary workers into small communities in the Hawke's Bay or in Marlborough, in Central Otago, you actually change significantly the dynamics in those communities as well. Well, what about the challenges looking at Kiribati and Tuvalu? In 1967, the population of Kiribati was 46,000. and 9,000 of those people lived in South Tarawa. I know this quite well because I was invited in 1967 to do a study of urban problems in South Tarawa. And the problems were exactly the problems that MFAT is addressing today, when the population of South Tarawa is 51,000 people. Water supply, sewage disposal, work. In 1967, I remember a discussion with the resident commissioner, a New Zealander, about the findings of the study that we did on urbanisation. I said, it's not going to work at just allowing open migration to South Tarawa. As a geographer, you have a huge problem. You've got a strip of coral that has a finite limit. It's quite different from bringing people into a big island, even like, say, Viti Levu, where you've got a lot more land you can spread over. But if you've got the ocean here and the lagoon here, there's not much you can do. He said, under the British constitutional system, which will apply in Kiribati and Tuvalu, we will not be able to restrict mobility because of freedom of movement within the country. So right from the outset, even though there was an acknowledgement of very significant constraints in Kiribati and Tuvalu in terms of possible urban development, there was no real attempt to address the difficult problem that as your population grows and becomes more urbanised, can you in fact accommodate them adequately and provide work for them in the urban place. Tuvalu in 1967 had 5,000 people, and Funafuti, the capital, was a small district station, probably of about 500 or 600 people. 2017, as Ward's figures show, Kiribati is about 115,000. It's heading for over 200,000 by 2050. Tuvalu's about 11,000, and it's possibly not going to grow much more because the PAC actually does help Tuvalu in a real way in terms of relieving some population pressure, because at 75 out of 10,000 is very different from 75 out of 100,000. So the PAC doesn't make much sense the way it's constructed for relieving any issues about population growth in Kiribati. So looking ahead to the future, New Zealand has a strong historical engagement with these two Central Pacific atoll territories. And in my view, New Zealand's been very remiss, going back to Helen Clark's, I think, very unfortunate statement in the late 2000s that New Zealand is making no commitment to long-term support for these island countries by way of settlement in the event of climate change. And for many years on the MFAT website, there was a firm disclaimer that New Zealand has made no commitment for resettlement of people from these island countries. I don't know whether it's still there or not. I hope it's gone, but it was there for years, and I have to say it caused, I think, significant offence to the Prime Ministers of Kiribati and Tuvalu in the 2000s to actually sort of be told that, no, we're not considering that. Final point, we've got to watch a tendency in New Zealand now in our immigration policy to constantly make it temporary. We have probably, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I have looked at them before. I think we're actually bringing in fewer people for residence in New Zealand from the Pacific, excluding Fiji, which is different from the rest because of its skill mix and skilled migration from Fiji, and the Samoan quota, which is a fixed number that can come. But for all the other Pacific countries, numbers approved for residence have probably dropped in the last decade. Numbers for temporary work have grown enormously. But if you go back to the past, people didn't always move for temporary reasons. They often moved to improve their livelihood chances for their families. New Zealand's current immigration policy is very unfriendly to families, and particularly unfriendly to Pacific families, because there's no way Pacific families can meet the thresholds under what is now a closed category, the parent and adult sibling category for bringing in migrants, or under the new temporary migration program, the income threshold, which is set just below what half of New Zealanders earn, the median income, about $42,000. And if you don't have a job worth more than that, you can stay for a maximum of 3 years and then you have to go home. So it's all about use them and then send them home. And I think we have to rethink that, because that is not a strategy for supporting Pacific development long term. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Richard. Some really insightful thoughts, and I can't wait to get to the question time. So the last speaker we have is Professor Vijay Naidu. He will talk on the Fiji situation. Relay.
Malo, Sara. Kia ora tātou, bulapinaka, namaste, talofa lava. Taking off from Professor Bedford, talking about anniversary, this is 30 years since the first coup in Fiji, which had very significant demographic effects on the country. And just anticipating that next year will be the University of the South Pacific's 50th anniversary year. And the University of the South Pacific's headquarters is located in the Royal New Zealand Air Force's former base in Lodala Bay. So for us, it's been a major peace dividend. Wonderful. My commentaries respond largely to Ward's presentation and all those very nice graphs that he used to illustrate the demographic changes taking place in the region. With respect to Fiji, we have undergone a demographic transition. So we are more like New Zealand in terms of a declining population as well as an aging population. So if you look at the graphs, the Fiji graph is a bit more rounded rather than a triangle, which indicates that the older people are increasing in terms of the overall proportions. However, there are ethnic differences within the country in terms of the country's demographics and the fertility rates. The ethnic Fijian proportion of the population continues to increase, and the fertility rate amongst ethnic Fijians are greater than for the other components of the population. And as a result, over time, the ethnic Fijian population has increased from being around 40% to now being close to 60%. And the Indo-Fijian population, the ethnic Indian population, declining from around 50% to about 35%. So there's been this significant change. Fiji has now become a country of emigration as well as immigration, and I can respond to questions about who the immigrants might be. We have had both long-term migration as well as short-term migration. We were not part of the Kickstart program in 2007 because we were undergoing another one of these post-coup experiences, and we were a country that was sanctioned by Australia, New Zealand, and the Commonwealth, and so we were not part of the 5 or so Kickstart countries. But we have a long history of migration with New Zealand, as Dick would tell you. Back in the 1960s, People were coming here to work on the farmland, to cut tussock grass, for example, in terms of short-term labor migration. Remittances have become very important in the Fijian economy. And this is part of the triple win situation. Remittances have played a very positive role in terms of poverty alleviation in the country, especially post-coup. So from 2004, we have seen this very steep climb in remittances in the country, so that now it is the second largest foreign exchange earner for Fiji. It's close to $500 million Fijian dollars, and it's second to tourism in terms of its contribution to GDP. And it's a mixture, I think, primarily of short-term labor migration, but also to some extent the long-term labor migration. So increasingly, Fiji has become a country with mirab types of characteristics. Over time, there's been changes in family structure. If you look at the size of families, they've tended to decline, following each census, year. We have both internal migration and international migration, and there is a kind of interrelationship between the two. And in terms of the triple win situation, they, of course, with some qualifications, I think Fiji has generally benefited from both short-term, long-term migration. Although in terms of the long-term migration, we have lost as much as 15% of our population in the last 30 years. And many of them, as Dick was indicating, professional tradespeople. And this is a very significant sort of, I think, negative impact in terms of the brain drain. We did a study around 2008, 2009, under the sort of heading of development on the move. So extensive sort of structural database and structural questionnaire, Fiji-wide, and we found that overall there were very positive outcomes of Fiji becoming more of a transnationalized country. So that's been very positive. In terms of the post-2015 period, when short-term seasonal labor migration, both to Australia and New Zealand, started, generally, with respect to New Zealand, it's very positive, but there is an issue around people absconding and trying to overstay. And 25 villages have been banned from participating in the scheme. So the opposition is very unhappy about this. This is like, because of some individuals, whole villages are, penalized. With respect to Australia, there's been much more negative publicity about the arrangements there. And this is, I think, because of what Dick said, was the more complex arrangement here that allows for the protection of workers. Perhaps it's becoming less so, there's been some erosion, but certainly in the Fiji media, this is not an issue. In the Australian case, there have been all kinds of allegations, including allegations of slavery and forced sort of labor. That negative publicity means that for the average Fijian who is a potential short-term labor migrant, you're looking more at New Zealand than at Australia in terms of participating in the exchange program. So in the Fiji case, I think from what I read from the utterances of the Minister of Employment, they're really looking at this short-term labor migration is very positive, and is a very important aspect of alleviating employment problems in the country, generating revenues, especially post Cyclone Winston. You got your own Cyclone Winston here, but how Cyclone Winston was a Category 5 cyclone, and that caused a lot of devastation. And so now there is a focus on some of these villages and settlements that have been affected, and so they believe that the experience and funds earned will help boost the recovery process in these places. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I might rearrange this in relation to just the question and answer time. I'm wondering if do you wish to sit at the front of the table, panel? And to the audience, we have a mic that is roving, and someone has the responsibility of passing it. Okay, great. The back there. If you wish to ask a question, just indicate. Okay. Yes, get a muffin, grab a cuppa. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, thank you very much, panel. A hand of applause. That's really, really good. Okay, I'll kick off the discussion. So this is to either of you in relation to your work and your research. So how would you see New Zealand improving labour mobility, both temporal and permanent, for Pacific?
That's a big question, particularly given the announcement we're supposed to hear this afternoon about the next government, because I think whatever emerges out of the discussions around the coalition, one of the things that will be high on the agenda is a focus on reducing the permanent and long-term net migration gain to New Zealand. And because a lot of that net migration gain is actually made up of temporary visa holders, temporary workers or students, I think the climate for discussing expansion of opportunities for temporary migration could be constrained for a while the new government, whichever side it is, sorts out its policy. But I think in answering the question, New Zealand, the people who deal with immigration need it, first of all, to reflect again on what this process of population movement involves. I guess one of the things that distresses me most about, not just in New Zealand, but internationally, the trend to talk about migration is to get rid of the notion that the individuals that you want to work in your labour market, the units of labour that you need, are somehow disconnected from their social context. They don't have a social context. They're units that you can get, plug into your labour market, fulfil a need in the labour market, and then increasingly they have to go what they call home, the place that they've come from. That was never the pattern of migration. If you just look at the 19th century and the early 20th century, migration was about people moving, often on their own initially, but subsequent to arrival and establishing a base in a new place, having the right to think about, well, do I have a family come and join me and be part of my new life here? Now, New Zealand does have a residence program, and the residence program has been effectively managed, very well managed, if you look at management in terms of numbers. Leanne Dalzell basically set the framework for the current residence program in 2002. 45 to 50,000 residence approvals each year, and if you go back over that 15-year period, you will find very few years when it exceeds 50,000 permanent residence approvals, and you'll find a few years where it's below 45,000. So in a sense, you say it's worked extremely well. It's been managed, and it is not the cause of the current permanent and long-term net migration problem that some people like to identify. And those are your real migrants. Those are people who've been approved to live here and with their immediate family, and for some of them you can also negotiate, your brothers and sisters might be able to join you, and maybe if you're really lucky now, your mother and father might be allowed to join you. But that's actually quite difficult for an awful lot of people, and as I say, that category is now closed. So no new migrant to New Zealand, doesn't matter who you are, can actually register to bring their mother and their father here. Now that's a very unusual context, looking back over time, to migration. Because migration's about people. It's not about units of labour. It's not about something that just contributes to your productivity, your GNP as a country. So I guess my biggest plea to New Zealand immigration policy people is, as they contemplate, and I've heard this is being talked about, a Pacific mobility visa or some sort of visa that might apply for the Pacific peoples, for heaven's sake, don't restrict it entirely to temporary movement. When you look at the demography that Ward has talked about, and I've got a table which I can leave at the back if anybody wants it, which looks at the populations of all these Pacific countries from 1966 through to 2050 and puts New Zealand's population alongside the Pacific ones. If you look at the Pacific in the next 20 to 30 years, whereas in the 60s, New Zealand and the Pacific's total population, including Papua New Guinea, were not that far apart. When we look out to the 2030s and 2040s, the Pacific's got 4 times New Zealand's population. And if you take Papua New Guinea out of the equation, you've almost got a population in the Pacific that's as big as New Zealand's population. You can't just keep sending people home that want to make a livelihood somewhere for their children, for their families. If Māori had had the opportunity to do that in the 1840s, 1850s, we would have had a very different Aotearoa. And most of those of us with white skin, who are New Zealanders, wouldn't be here. And New Zealanders need to appreciate something about their own history and about the fact that in this country, the indigenous population actually didn't necessarily want all the migrants, but it didn't have the power to stop them. At the moment, we are exercising a very cherry-picking approach in migration. We pick who we want, but we cloak it in a discourse of development for the countries that the migrants come from. Now, I don't want to discount what Vijay said, the importance of remittances, the importance of temporary work. Of course, lots of people don't want permanent work, but let's have some ventilation in the system for people that do actually find they want to stay, and especially their children who get educated here. Kia ora.
Thank you, Dick. Any questions from the floor?
Kia ora. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. My name is Angela Wilton, and I work with Oxfam New Zealand. Thank you to all of you for your very interesting presentations. I have been writing copious notes, so clearly you had a lot of gems in there that I have taken with me. I have 2 questions, and they are semi-related. One is, I guess, your response to the PACER Plus conversations, particularly around the labour mobility discussions around that, recognizing that there will be considerable social impacts around those agreements for those who have signed on and those who have not. So I'm just keen to get your take on that. And the second question, I guess, is connected to that, but recognizing, I guess, the strong reliance from a developmental and economic sense on remittances and the role that remittances play on I suppose, a country's economy, recognizing that remittances also are very much a person-to-person arrangement, connected also to, obviously, labor mobility. But in my own head, trying to bridge the divide between, I guess, those individual, family, intra-family connections and what that means, as to, I suppose, national budgets and the way in which countries are able to provide the services that would be expected, be it health budgets, education budgets, etc. I suppose that's also connected to PACER Plus, with an understanding that perhaps there's an assumption that remittances will fill the gap, but it's a different kind of flow of funding. So, and also recognizing that not all people benefit from labor mobility. There are some families that do, and some families that do not. So, from a national budget perspective, what are your thoughts, as well as through the PACER Plus lens? Sorry, that was a very complicated question. I hope my points came out.
Is there anyone from the panel who would like to respond first? Vijay?
Thank you. Those two questions are quite difficult ones, but I'll try and respond as best as I can. As you know, Fiji is not a signatory to the PACER Plus agreement at this point in time, nor is Papua New Guinea. Vanuatu hesitated for a little bit, but has now signed on to it. And I think one of the issues around the negotiations is about the development component of PACER Plus. And the islands have been arguing that we need any kind of trade agreements to actually boost our development, situation, or development foundation, so that we are better able to trade. Many of the countries actually have nothing to trade with, And the larger countries like Fiji and Papua New Guinea have a complex range of products to trade, and they want PACER Plus to help them with these products so that they boost their output. And of course, coming together with PACER Plus is this whole business of biosecurity. And because we are generally raw material producers and producers of agricultural commodities, it is not unusual that the biosecurity requirements actually are far too rigorous in terms of standards, both in OECD and in Australia and New Zealand. And so in order to boost the island countries' ability to trade agricultural products, you need to help them get into those standards. And this means more development assistance and less emphasis on just straight out trade. The one very important dimension of PACER Plus that the island countries have been insisting on is this business of the migration of natural persons. And this is very important component, generally, but particularly for the Melanesian countries, which, Ward has pointed out, has this problem of the youth bulge. And one of the sad aspects of this youth bulge is that, unfortunately, socially, youth in a number of these Pacific Island countries are not seen in a positive light. They're not seen as, your actually labor force, the people who will contribute to the productive potential of the country. Instead, they are seen as burdens on society. And a part of that problem, there are many different dimensions to it. One has to do with the fact that there is not enough training opportunities, the social protection for youth, preparing them for the labor market. And throughout the Pacific, there is this misfit between the demands for labor and the qualifications, and the training that the labor force have. So this is an issue. And so one of the reasons why the countries in general, but particularly the Melanesian countries, are trying to get the labor component of Plaza Plus put into this scheme is because this will help relieve the pressure on creating jobs within these countries. It's a big challenge, and I have a lot of sympathy for what Dick was saying in terms of, actually having a labor force that serves your country, within the country well, but also having the skills to be able to migrate and contribute significantly to the country of destination, the host country. There are negative impacts of the labor migration, and I can spend a lot of time talking about it, but it can be socially disruptive, and including on families and how families are able to maintain themselves. So this is an issue that we need to talk about a little bit more. Often there is also a gender dimension in all these, so we have to look at it in terms of particular countries. The reliance on remittances. Remittances actually, generally speaking, are broken down into two broad categories. One is the business of gifts and maintenance. That's what our Bureau of Statistics uses, and the majority of remittances come in that way. Because remittances have become so sizable, our tax people are now requiring people to indicate how much they are getting. And this is all formalized. The Reserve Bank of Fiji actually talks with the banks, with the foreign exchange dealers on these matters to keep a tab on how much money is coming through and trying to tax some of it. It is true that much of it is person to person, family to family, and therefore does contribute to inequality in society because not all families receive remittances. I think there would be ethnic differences as well. In the case of indigenous Fijians, because there's a wider recognition of kinship, ties and kinship networks. So remittances money can have wider linkages than, say, amongst other ethnicities. And as I was saying earlier, remittances also contribute to families' ability to contribute to health and to education. Now, the problem I think that Oxfam is implying has to do with national budgets relating to social development, social protection, and to the social sector. So health, housing, education. In the Fijian case, it's a real issue. It's a real issue because a very significant amount of our national budget goes into the security forces, particularly the military. We have a large standing army, and I dare say the infantry battalion is probably as big as or even bigger than New Zealand's. It's certainly bigger than Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea has a population of about 8 million people. Ours hasn't reached 1 million. Our military force is about, if you take both the regulars and the reserves, is about 9,000, 10,000. Papua New Guinea's is probably about 1,000 to 2,000. It's a very significant difference. And so our military forces actually constitute a major burden on our national budget. And so if we are not careful, what can happen is that we continue to provide the security forces with a lot more funding than to the social sector. Fortunately, in balance, what I can say is that Fiji's budget for education is the highest budget line, for the national budget as a whole, annually for a number of years now. But in terms of the health services, the allocation to the security forces is around about the same as we allocate to our health services, and our health services have been declining. I hope I've responded or tried to respond to your question. Thank you.
Vijay's done a really good job at doing it, but I think the key points are that, PACER Plus is a trade agreement in many ways, and yet there are so many other ways in which trade is not being facilitated under PACER Plus. So it's getting less of a sense of its development possibilities. And some work that I've done recently on, for instance, on the cut trade industry between New Zealand and the Pacific demonstrates that. It's very difficult to get that niche product into the New Zealand market for a whole range of reasons, and yet it is a niche market that can make a difference. So just to undermine that kind of component. And the other one is about remittances, and I just want to kind of mention the way in which remittances have become have got caught up in this process of what I call financialisation. Initially, it was between one person to, family to family, but there are many other people involved now. There are the banks that are involved, the tax government, the tax that the government wants. So there's this whole process of financialisation that's going on, where you want to get a bit of that pie of remittances, and I think we've got to be really careful about who is actually then benefiting from the continued flow of remittances, because as Vijay says, it's very hard to see it enter the formal budget process, but it can foreclose government's roles in other areas. And so it allows, for instance, government to provide fees for education, or to set fees for education, knowing that possibly remittances will cover that. But certainly in the health field, I think, as Vijay mentioned, that's very evident in many countries. Remittances will support family health systems and education systems. So I just wanted to kind of underline that with that.
Around gender.
Yeah.
So just about gender, my insight was very male-dominated, with the exception of very few female voices, Yvonne.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering, what is your view around more women in terms of their labour mobility from the Pacific to here?
Well, of course, there have always been women bringing their labour to New Zealand in all sorts of ways, from the very, very early days, where women from the Pacific came and worked on remote farms in the Pacific, and this is where we see small communities of Pacific folk in rural areas. So there has always been that move, but we need here, of course, to recognise the kind of reproductive component of when we talk about women moving and gender. There have been some countries, I think Vanuatu, who are quite explicit about including women in their programs. So I think there has been a good effort to try and include women in programs. But I think I have real concerns about the extent to which the programs acknowledge women's role both in the care economy and also in the gift economies of Pacific communities. So in the care economy, of course, there are a whole lot of immediate practices around immediate families, but also ageing families. And in the gift economy, of course, women are also play a really important role in facilitating those important cultural connections in places of origin. So I think, on the one hand, I'd like to be able to say we do need to have more women engaged in these programs, but we've got to, in doing that, we've got to be very careful that we don't use some practices which I know have occurred, where in order to deal with women's reproductive labour, we require, and this happens in some other programs, we require women, for instance, to have to be tested to make sure they're not pregnant, to be put on family planning programs so that they don't get pregnant while they're away. There is this has happened in other programs. I don't know the extent to which it's happened in New Zealand, but it has happened and it continues to be a consideration for ensuring that you get, as Dick said, the labour gets done and you don't get these other unexplained extra bits of labour coming in as well. The other issue I'd really have to say is, and it was a concern that we had in Kiribati, where there is a growth of I'm not sure it's called the micro visa, the Melanesian visa, where there is a demand for domestic help and domestic labour in the remote resort areas of Australia. And of course Kiribati sees this as a possibility of filling some of those labour shortages. However, to think about taking young women from South Tarawa, training them over a relatively short period of time and popping them into a 5-star resort in Australia, that's actually quite a big ask. Not only is it a big ask, the research in the past has shown that it's been pretty diabolical for the women involved. And I think people are aware possibly of the example of, I think it was 6 or 7 young women who ended up being on a Norwegian hospitality ship. And of those 7 or 8 young women, one of them took her own life and the rest of them became pregnant. So this is not a great story. It does really demonstrate that we've got to pay particular attention to that. On the other hand, many young women in South Tarawa enjoyed the possibility of the freedom that being in a labour market such as this, away from the confines of South Tarawa. For young women, it was an adventure. There was some freedom. There was some, and there was a curiosity. So we've got to really balance both sides of that argument up very carefully. And I just think we need to come back to what the basic principles are. If we're talking about ensuring we have sustainable relationships, then we've got to move much more carefully to understanding the different role that men and women play in their families and in their gift economies at home, and also when they come into communities here in New Zealand.
Peter Lund from the Auckland office of MFAT. Richard, thanks in particular for putting things in a historical context. I think you're making us aware that labour mobility is not something new. It's actually been around for a long time. I found that really interesting. But look, I'd be interested in the panel's views about the future of labour mobility in New Zealand. Obviously, the RSE program's been underpinned by horticulture and agriculture. I'd be interested in, are there other sectors that you see as providing real opportunities for the future? Obviously, the RSE scheme's been underpinned by, it's an employer-driven scheme, and there's an onus on those employers to be good employers, with a lot of focus on pastoral care, and I think that has really made the scheme. You made the comparison with Australia, but I would be interested in your views about where do things go in the future. Obviously, linked to PACER Plus is a commitment to have an annual labour mobility conference involving all the Pacific countries. There's a lot of ideas out there, and I think for Pacific countries, they do want to make this work. But look, be interested in some views on that. Thank you.
Very timely question, I think. Yes, there are other sectors that could benefit from opportunities to attract a wider pool of labour than they can obtain locally. But of course, in those sectors, we have to be conscious that the RSE is premised on a very important principle that the New Zealander has to be given first choice of the work. And while some people say that sounds like lip service rather than reality, because there's nearly 10,000 seasonal workers brought in under the scheme at the moment, having worked on the scheme for a decade now, it is certainly not lip service. The requirement for employers every year to demonstrate that they are trying to get New Zealanders into that seasonal work before they get the approval of their ATRs to recruit Pacific labour remains very much a central part of the program. The other thing that's really important to bear in mind, though, about the RSE, it's something that isn't acknowledged enough, is that the employer pays half the airfare. There's no other temporary migration scheme in New Zealand where the employer actually pays half of the travel costs to get the worker here. And that's different from Australia, where the employer pays a fixed cost, a share of, but it's fixed, doesn't matter where the worker comes from, they all pay the same cost. In New Zealand, the costs are linked to where the workers are coming from, except regrettably for Kiribati and Tuvalu, where they pay half the airfare from Fiji. The Kiribati and Tuvaluans have to get themselves to Fiji before they benefit from that half airfare. And that was put in place simply to have some employers go to Kiribati and Tuvalu to recruit labour, because the cost was going to be much greater than going to Vanuatu or to Samoa and Tonga. There is a construction pilot which has been carried out with a small number from Samoa, Tonga and Fiji, mainly Fiji, but one or two other workers from those other countries. That is currently being evaluated, and the likelihood is that when the Pacific Labour Mobility Conference takes place in Brisbane shortly, that I think New Zealand's hoping to be able to say that they can open that up and have a bigger number of people coming to work in the construction industry. But that is a very different prospect from the RSE. The worker pays all the costs. They pay their airfare to New Zealand, they pay their tools, they are literally on the same provisions as a temporary worker coming under any other temporary work visa. So it's not appropriate to compare any of those sort of other schemes that they're talking about with the RSE, because the employer is not required to pay half the airfare. They are required to have a pastoral care program, and so that is one element that will be retained in the construction if it's extended. The other big area that is of interest, I think, in the Pacific and in New Zealand is around the caring industry, the aged care industry, where already there's a significant employment of Pacific Island people, and often many women are involved in that sector. And of course that sector's had, fortunately recently, a reasonably substantial salary adjustment, which has been helpful for workers there, because it was a pretty low paid sector, I think, in the past. I'm not aware of a firm scheme that's being piloted there. The other pilot that's sitting on the table but runs into visa problems in New Zealand because of the nature of the employment contract is the seafarer one, which has been explored with Sealord and with some of the bigger employers of seafarers in New Zealand. And this is a scheme deliberately hoping to support Kiribati and Tuvalu trained seafarers. But the problem with that one is that the fishing companies enter into individual contracts with each of their employees. So in other words, their employees are contractors rather than employees. And under the special visa that they want to offer, I don't think that is allowed. I mean, I don't have all the details of this, but that's my understanding, that one has a technical problem linked with it, with the nature of the employment agreement. It's very hard to hold the employer to a contract for a group of workers if each one is on an individual kind of contract. Australia has been much more generous in opening up sectors under its seasonal work program. It has already the tourism sector, which is another one New Zealand could be looking at. It has a much wider range of agricultural sectors, not just horticulture, but they've extended it to cane farming, they've extended it to, it's still in the agricultural realm, but they're different, they're not necessarily all seasonal. But they're struggling with, as Vijay said, and it's more to do with the nature of the relationships. As Yvonne said, the critical thing about the RSE that I think has made the RSE be viewed reasonably positively both by workers, island governments and New Zealand's immigration people is the relationship that's been developed between employers and the groups that they're employing. But there is a real emerging issue there, and that is the growing dependence by employers on the same workers because they don't have to train them and they've got an English language capacity now, which is what they want. But a growing, even more problematic in my view, although economists disagree with this, and that is a growing dependence by the workers on this wage that they get every year from seasonal work in New Zealand for their livelihood and their family's livelihood, rather than what I think was the original intention, was the idea that the Labour wouldn't want to come back all the time because it's hard work and they're separated from their families for long periods, that people would come for a number of years, accumulate quite a lot of money, and use that money to build or extend the sustainable livelihoods that they might have back at home. But in fact, what's happening is, not for most, but for a growing number of workers, they're effectively becoming a permanent, temporary, low-wage group in the New Zealand labour force, because they're choosing to come back every year and work at wages which are always pegged to the minimum wage. Doesn't mean they all earn the minimum wage, but the piece rate that they get paid is pegged to a minimum wage. The hourly rate, the minimum they have to be paid is the minimum wage. And so there's no real growth. If you're here 10 years, 12 years, and in the case of the Canadian scheme, 20 years, working on a seasonal labour scheme, you're not actually growing your career or your job or your prospects for your family, other than sending back money every year to cover your costs back at home. Now, economists tell me, well, that's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. They're all being looked after. They've got an income. But then the question arises, as has already been raised in your question, I think, your question about the national impacts of this. That has a significant impact on communities if you're pulling out every year the same people, year after year after year, on their families, and their families cannot join them ever at the destination under the terms of the policy. So it needs rethinking. We've raised it with the employers, we've raised it with immigration, we've suggested as they develop the scheme further, they try and encourage more rotation, partly to spread the benefits of the schemes back in the islands. As your question pointed out, there are families that are in and there are families that are out. And if you're out, or your village is out, and you can't get in, then the variations that are emerging in the rural areas in Samoa and Tonga between families that are in the scheme and families that are out of the scheme are growing greater all the time. So there's some questions there, I think, about how it evolves in the future. But to answer your question, definitely scope for more. But in all scoping, have a long-term view to what if an employer and the worker wants to have a long-term career in this area? What if the employer wants to train in horticulture and become employee and become part of a permanent workforce? Is that ever going to be possible? Under the RSE, no. There is no provision for anybody, no matter how, unless they come under the pack and they happen to get the employer to take them back. If they're balloted under the pack, then they can go back to their employer and say, I've now got a visa that will allow me to stay. Can you pay me over $40,000 a year and I'll be allowed to come? But aside from them, the scheme makes no provision for any long-term career growth and prospect there.
Lucky last? Okay. Last one, lucky last? Okay.
But just to pick up on something that both Vijay and Richard touched upon, which is the kind of darker side of labour mobility, which is forced labour and trafficking in persons. When New Zealand had its first conviction last year for trafficking, and possibly more in the pipeline, do you think we're doing enough, and what can we do better to raise the awareness of risks amongst Pacific migrant workers, because they're always the ones most at risk, and also maybe comment on the willingness of migrant workers to take those risks, and if there's anything we can do about that as well?
I think this is probably going to become a really, really big issue in New Zealand, not just from the point of view of exposing trafficking and illegal payments to work with, underpaying workers or not giving them the entitlements that they're legally obliged to give them in New Zealand. But there is another really important dimension to it, and that is the reaction, particularly if they're in the agricultural industry, those workers, that is the reaction of the purchasers of our produce. And what is going to have just as much an impact on how that issue plays out is how New Zealand employers very quickly come to appreciate that they are threatening their own livelihoods very directly if the employer rather than a contractor is the person who's responsible for the illegal employment relationship, how they actually are threatening their own business. And I'll just give you an example which I think was illustrative of this. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment is looking much more carefully at compliance with our labour regulations and laws, and our current caretaker Minister of Immigration, Michael Woodhouse, has probably done more than most ministers of immigration in recent years to try and get a focus around compliance with our labour laws in different parts of the industry. Well, recently a number of pack houses in the northern part of the South Island were found to have some deficiencies in their records. Now, it wasn't an accusation that they were illegally paying their workers, but somehow the records didn't quite tally with everything that was supposed to be shown in those records around holiday pay, entitlements and so on. Before there was a news release about that in New Zealand, information by social media had reached the UK. The UK, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, our biggest kind of purchasers of horticultural produce, or much horticultural produce in the UK, had a message back to New Zealand the next day that no produce from those orchards should be included. Because the UK's recently, as you're aware, signed a Modern Slavery Act, and they are becoming, their big supermarket chains are becoming extremely conscious of the provisions relating to labour in the countries that they're purchasing produce from. So it's a very interesting issue. I think there will need to, there are a whole lot of dimensions to it, because some of the employers and recruiters of that labour are from the countries that they're bringing the labour in from, so they're exploiting networks within their own countries that they've come from and got permanent residence in New Zealand. There are different attitudes around labour and what coming to New Zealand means. For some, coming from some parts of the world, it is just better than anything they can imagine at home. So if you can get some money, even if it's not the legal wage, that's better than nothing, perhaps, in some cases. So I think it's a major issue that's going to get bigger, but I do think that part of the issue will be addressed by the compliance that our markets will place for our produce, will place on our employers to observe fair practice in the way that they use their labour. So it'll have a multi-dimensional response.
Just to quickly add to what Professor Bedford has said, with respect to forced labour and trafficking, there are internal issues within Fiji. For example, Chinese, especially women, have been trafficked into the country, largely as sex workers, and this is a big problem because the government itself has become very close to the Chinese government and basically has overlooked many of the issues around Chinese immigration to Fiji, one of which is the trafficking. Related but somewhat separately is this business of people adopting young children from Fiji, and sometimes this is for purposes other than what's been said in the application processes. With respect to our short-term labor migrants, I think the important thing, and Dick has said this, is the expectations. The workers come abroad with certain expectations, and when these expectations are not met, there should be some mechanisms to have some kind of mediation, negotiation to settle the issue. It's not a problem generally here in New Zealand, but certainly in Australia and in the Middle East. It's a huge problem, where workers have actually been duped by recruiters and contractors. They turn up there assuming they'll be earning, an amount of US dollars a week, a month, and they find they get a fraction of it. And this leads to a lot of disappointment and frustration. And so it then, and of course, you can't change employers, and then it becomes a category of forced labor. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to, I'm still mulling over a lot of things that were discussed today in today's session. I just want to thank the New Zealand Institute of Pacific Research for this opportunity to discuss Pacific labour mobility. Big thank you to Professor Ward Friesen, Yvonne Te Ruku Orangi Underhill-Sem, Professor Richard Dick Bedford, and Professor Vijay Naidu for joining us today. Big round of applause. So this might turn into a paper, do you think, or might write a few things about it. But we're all contactable, and I will tweet the contacts, email and Twitter.